Hey class, hard to believe it's been 8 weeks in MOD564. Prior to this course, I thought about conflict way differently. Though it's a little horrible to admit, I always thought it was to the benefit of people who are skilled at managing conflict, to work with people that are avoidant to conflict or just do everything they can to stay away from it. There's a scene from The Office where Robert California gets his job that comes to mind here, but always thought about it as zero sum. So that changed. And my view of conflict changed to encompass a broader stakeholder view and obtaining better understanding of all factors at play to make a decision that's mutually beneficial to both sides whenever possible. But not every conflict is going to have clearly defined goals. And that was a big sort of tonal shift. So, one of the fundamental ideas is that people use different conflict styles in the way that they manage conflict in their personal or professional lives. There are distinct tactics associated with many different kinds of conflict management style. I think it's important to go through them quickly before we go into some of the other stuff in this presentation. Conflict avoidance is exactly as it sounds. It's going to great lengths to avoid conflict. It's different from conflict prevention as it's not removing the barriers or obstacles preventing understanding. It's sort of burying your head in the sand and hoping that things get better. It often leads to corrosive interpersonal relationships, and people who are in a conflict avoidance style should step up a little bit. That said, getting to the table is only one piece of the equation. In dispute resolution and conflict management, accommodation is potentially being overly flexible to the other party to the net detriment of your own interests. Though it's the prioritization of not causing conflict inside the negotiation itself. Collaboration can be a great tool for resolving conflict. It allows all stakeholders to get their viewpoint across and relies heavily on consensus. This emphasis on consensus, however, makes collaboration an inefficient method for resolving conflict, especially as organizations scale. For that reason, it may not be realistic to collaborate at all times. Next, we have compromise. Compromise is splitting the difference. It's trying to find a middle path that may be between the goals of both stakeholders. It's not always the most creative or inventive, but compromise emphasizes getting a deal taken care of. We tried this in the West Wind and Pine Hills negotiation to limited success. Lastly, we have competition, which is playing to win. I chose to use Scarlett, who's a professional StarCraft player. StarCraft being a single-player video game where only one person can win is my example. I'm also reminded of my experiences playing tennis, though it's a little different because you also have a partner, so there is some teamwork there. But it's playing to win. So these tactics come into play when we're looking to resolve and prevent conflict in the workplace in particular. It's important to have strategies in place and practice active listening to make sure that conflicts are being evaluated, isolated, and resolved prior to blowing up into being a big deal. This can tamp down noise and improve workplace efficiency, but it's important to understand individual stakeholders. For that reason, I chose a conflict that's been resolved at Apple as an example. These folks back in 2011 or so were protesting Apple's approach towards mining rare earth minerals, which was at the time deemed exploitative. That's since been resolved, and comprehensive supplier reports that lead in the industry have come to help illuminate what used to be a dark spot for not just Apple, but most of the tech world. Integral to this course was understanding what a negotiation is and how to do it differently to recognize the views of all stakeholders, prepare materials, and get to a resolution that effectively takes care of all parties. This text really helps out with all of that and illuminated the key steps there. Much like the negotiation text, the Workplace Investigations book outlined a procedural method to get to justice in the workplace, helped identify root causes, and really stressed the importance of positive intent when working with a team. Positive intent being the idea that what something may look like needs to be evaluated against what actually is going on. And we found during a lot of the negotiations we did, the one with Twyla and the Lyric Opera also could have been up here. This is Ramke, Luke, and I for the West Wind and Pine Hills. We really used a whole host of these different strategies. I played a little bit too hard to win and actually threatened to leave the discussion. And I gotta say, if I were in a workplace and that conflict came up, I wouldn't be able to walk away like that. There would be a need for it to be resolved. And part of the conflict assessment is figuring out exactly which tools need to be used, whether or not it needs to be mediated, arbitrated, whether or not you need an ombudsman in your organization. There's so many considerations based on the type of organization, but choosing the right one for the institution is really important, and it involves really understanding what's at play, what's going on. Is this issue systemic? Is this issue interpersonal? Is this issue cultural? and then putting the tools in place to get that taken care of. And that's where having really impartial folks acting as arbitrators and having a really fair process comes into play. So with that, I was really interested in finding out the alternative dispute resolution pipeline and the process to determine the most effective alternative dispute resolution processes for individual organizations. It makes total sense. So many other business needs change as businesses scale and grow, but it's still fascinating to learn. And so I apply that to creating effective and inclusive teams at Apple. I think that, Apple is incredibly diverse, but perhaps not quite diverse enough. That's definitely a conversation that's at the forefront of national discourse right now. But there is a celebration of people with different ideas and different backgrounds. And I believe that creates a more effective workplace. But part of that's empowering people to step up and have positive conflict, which can be really hard to lead, which is why this course is so valuable, because learning how to lead and curate positive conflict while also tamping down any of the factors that could create negative conflict is incredibly important. All right, I chose E-Town here, but I also think of my own work where I have to do a lot of facilitation of content. I actually thought that the role of an effective facilitator in dispute resolution was a really interesting sort of perspective to learn in this class. It really highlighted the focus of establishing an agenda and keeping the discussion focused on the agenda, and to make sure to test for agreements. I think that's really going to help me out in the workplace, especially with the technical nature of my work. If there was one piece of advice I could give after taking this class to anyone interested in resolving disputes, I'd recommend to really listen and find out what's going on, and to try to remove any biases from the equation before getting started. I had a great time learning with all of you. Thank you so much for your time. I look forward to hearing your presentations.